Well, tonight on Queer News Tonight, we have a very interesting interview with somebody that practically needs no introduction in South Florida, and that's Lorenzo Robertson, the executive director of the Ujima Men's Collective. The organization, as a nonprofit advocacy and activist of Lorenzo, helps our LGBTQ community in so many different ways. Lorenzo, welcome to Queer News Tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, gives us an outstanding opportunity to talk about the projects that are you're passionate about in our community. First, for those that don't know what Ujima Men's Collective is all about, help describe what you do.
Well, we're an organization with nonprofit, as you stated. We have 5 tenets that we work under, which is leadership, advocacy, spirituality, relationships, health and wellness, and how those things relate to being Black, same-gender loving men. That's our focal point. But also we look at when we're talking about Black, same-gender loving men, it's also those that love and support them. So we really are open to any part of the community, but that's our focus. We really try to make sure that our focus is really work on Black, same-gender loving men being able to live their lives authentically and living in the light.
And the program that you do, we're going to talk about the conference in a few minutes, but the programs that you do for Black, same-gender loving men, you do all year long, educational. Describe some of the kinds of programs you do besides the conference.
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing now, we have our Brothers Project, and Brothers is an acronym for Brothers Reaching Out to Help Another Son. And it's really about trying to uplift Black, same-gender loving men in the terms of social justice and equity. So we've been doing a series of community conversations around those areas. We've done some on living with HIV. We've done one on pronouns. Our one that's coming up currently is going to be "And My Eyes Are Open." It's really about being woke in the state of Florida.
I know you have a lot of support from the Our Fund Foundation. They're doing a tremendous job in helping to propel our marginalized communities inside LGBT. Help people understand. We're going through kind of a metamorphosis at Hotspots Magazine and Happening Out television network in sitting in Wilton Manors, but we can't help notice how white, older, privileged male Wilton Manors is.
Yeah.
It's taken a few days, but we kind of started to figure it out, and now we really are in an intentioned way kind of fumbling through the process of how can we be better for women, for trans, for people of color, both Black and Latina specifically. Why is there an issue for Black men in the LGBTQ community? Why does it seem and appear to be so much more difficult, both politically and culturally, health-wise? Why is it so much more difficult for men of color?
I think a part of it is really because sometimes Black, same-gender loving men are already marginalized in their own communities, in the Black community. Then we come into the larger LGBTQ plus community, then we're also marginalized again. And we don't necessarily have that support in that community. And sometimes we're not as supportive of each other as we can be. So we are a lot of times we are individually, independently trying to navigate the terrain of being a gay person, being a queer person in the arena. So therefore it's kind of a challenge to just be by yourself. And they're not necessarily embraced by some of the other parts of the LGBTQ community. So therefore we're continuously being on our own.
You know, I want to get into some of the politics that we're watching in Florida, especially toward the Black community and the gay LGBTQ community. But I want to zero in on what you just said, because you give rare exposure to those words. We have an issue in the Black community of as rejected as LGBTQ is broadly, the Black community, and maybe to a lesser extent, or maybe the same, I don't know, the Latino community. But we're talking about the Black community. Black community, especially in Black church, just seems to just go a step farther in terms of rejection to LGBT. Why do you think that is? So when you face the challenges you do in Black community, for Black LGBTQ community, why is your own Black community so fierce in rejection, or often fierce?
Some of it's just because especially in the South, we've grown up with the whole fire and brimstone, everything about the church. We are still looking at that from a familiar perspective. So therefore, a lot of times the preacher has taught us that, being gay is an abomination, you're going to hell, this lifestyle, all those types of things. And this has been inbred in a lot of us, and it's been inbred in our community. So when we think about the LGBTQ community in Black communities, that's the first thing that comes up. And then we add to that when HIV became a prominent part of our community, we were taught in our communities that HIV/AIDS has nothing really to do with the Black people. It's these white gay boys over here, and we can let it stay over there, not come into our communities. But again, that's something else. That was God's punishment for us being gay if we became HIV positive. So all those things are inbred in terms of how we are still navigating that now. Even when we look at HIV perspectives in Black communities, our perspectives and our incidents are higher than other populations, even though we've gotten some of the same information, we've got some of the same educational components, we've had some of the same testing, but we're still having higher rates of HIV in our communities. And we're still struggling with that. And the bigger part is also the stigma that's still associated with HIV, especially in Black communities.
You've been an activist. Is that what you call yourself? An activist. Okay.
No.
You've been an activist you have quite a history and longevity of that. Is it better today for the Black LGBTQ community, or has it gotten worse?
I would say it's almost the same, unfortunately, as it was in the early 80s. It hasn't really changed a lot. Unfortunately, now we're being attacked more now, especially if you're Black and you're part of the LGBTQ community. In our legislature, the things that are being spouted now are really targeting those two populations more so than others. But I think it's just as challenging now as it was many years ago.
Your observation gives me the segue to talk about what's going on in Florida. And we're watching a legislative body in Tallahassee that is arguably the most anti-LGBT that we've seen in the history of the state of Florida. And that's even in the days of Anita Bryant.
Right.
Pies in the face.
Exactly.
We long for the ability of just a simple pie in the face compared to what we're watching today. We have Governor DeSantis, and the governor seems to literally be hell-bent on focusing on his philosophies of the Black community and his philosophies on the LGBT community, specifically trans and drag queens, but broadly in schools and education. When the governor of your state says to launch his presidential campaign, which, by the way, he's done that. It says, wait, here's all of the things that I did, and Florida is a place where woke comes to die. When you first heard that phrase, what washed over you?
For me, it was just it's an awakening or reawakening that he's racist, he's misogynist, he's anti-gay, he's homophobic, because for you to say something like that, it was no rationale, there's no reason. For him, it should have been a joyous moment. He's the new governor, but instead he wants to start to attack certain parts of our community once again. And I'm just like, I don't know who hurt him in the past, but I think there was a Black gay person, because those are the people that continuously he targets.
He's on a retribution.
He continuously targets those populations, and I'm not sure why.
You're an educator in so many ways. You teach, and you can teach without being in a classroom. The governor has come out and said, Black history is something that we really shouldn't be addressing in our schools, which is breathtaking.
Right.
And an advanced AP course that's done in 28 states for decades. Yeah. He comes out and says, "Oh no, it's influencing our children in very bad ways because it's based on queer theory." When you heard black gay man, and you hear no Black history or advanced placement education for college and queer theory, when all of those concepts were wrapped together, what was your reaction?
It was just really about when he was saying these things, this kind of, his whole rhetoric is that there is no educational value to Black history. And I'm like, well, how can you talk about American history without talking about Black people? We were a part of every aspect of this country being built. We were a part of the educational components. We are so much entrenched in everything. So how can you say that there's no educational value, that you're going to talk about a component of people that were a part of everything? I just don't understand it. I mean, again, it goes back to the racism that he just continues to espouse, because you can't talk about any type of country, any type of entity, whereas if there are multiple types of people in it and you're going to erase and not talk about one part of it, you're not really talking about the totality of the history of that country.
You know, when I ask you that question and listen to your answer, I think about the number of politicians and artists and poets and entertainers that I have heard through the years that are German and talk about how proud they are of their society, that circle these days on our calendar, and they will always be there. But we moved beyond them. But we have to focus on those days to continue to remind ourselves. That's exactly what I just heard you say. He doesn't want to talk about a terrible past.
And my whole thing is, like, we have to talk about the past, because if we don't talk about it, we don't understand it, we don't learn from it, we're going to repeat it. So therefore, I'm like, why do you not want to share this information? Because regardless of how you want to look at Black people were a part of our country. Black people were enslaved in this country. We built this country. And so therefore, your children need to know that these buildings just didn't erect on their own. You know, cotton it wasn't picked by itself. Someone was doing these things. Someone built and provided a lot of the wealth for this country in terms of the work that they provided. And that should not be eradicated, should not be erased from the history.
Or at the very minimum, forgotten. So that's our issue in the Black community for you and our Black LGBTQ community, but specifically the men's collective. That's the politics in Florida, and we're watching it around the country. Then the last big pillar, it seems to me, that we have to talk about, we talked about it briefly at the top, is how the broad LGBTQ community deals with people of color, embracing people of color. We already talked about the problems and the problematic issues that go on. But broadly, do you think LGBT is doing a good enough job for our Black LGBTQ community?
No, not really, because I don't think in many instances the Black community is being embraced and being brought to the table in a lot of instances. Or if you are being brought in, you're being brought in as a token, so therefore it's not necessarily a real impact, or there's a real intentional way of bringing us in. Is bringing us in, say, oh, we've done this, we have a Black person on our board, or we have a Black person at the table. But it's not necessarily because you're intentionally trying to understand and also trying to broaden the scope of what you're doing by bringing multiple Black people in, because my monolithic view of Black people is very different from 20 other Black gay men. We're going to have different experiences, different journeys in terms of getting to where we are in terms of living our lives authentically.
Do you think, I've heard sentiment like that in recent weeks in the trans community. I've heard that in the women's community. And they all focus on the fact that it's, first, we got to have a seat at the table, but we have to have the right seat at the table, or it's tokenism. I'm curious in the women in the community and the trans representation in our community with the Black representation, people of color in our community. Do they support that segment of the community? Do they support each other in the way they should? And our major problem is with white LGBT?
I think it's a combination of both. We don't get enough support from each other. We do support, but it's not probably as broad as it could be. And I think sometimes the programs that we support are more so they're fun. The jovial parts of it is not necessarily the serious things that's going to really impact our community. And sometimes we think about the broader community. Again, it's like when we think about that, we look at our media, we look at our magazines, everything that deals with the LGBTQ community. When you look at those magazines, they're very rarely inclusive of a lot of other people. They're usually white gay men on the cover, white stories about white gay men and things that they've done. It doesn't have a lot of stories about Black gay men in there or other people of color. And if there is that, it's usually done maybe in June, possibly, but more so in February for Black History Month.
By the way, we did women last December, and we did Little Women in March.
So but it's those types of things, and I think that I think it just needs to be an intentional choice to make sure that we're being inclusive of all people in our community, and I think that's the thing that we fall short sometimes.
And Hotspots Magazine, Habanero Television Network, has a responsibility to do that better.